Yeah. In fact, I find it interesting here, the reaction of all involved. What a glorious, remarkable miracle that the man comes back and is able to see, and yet not everybody is as rejoicing in the experience. Well, why are the Jewish leaders so upset about this miracle? Why is it that they really interrogate the man, interrogate his parents, call the Savior into question? Why aren't they just rejoicing that a blind man has been healed?
One reason is their blindness. It's verse 14. It's performed on the Sabbath day.
Okay.
And you can't do this on the Sabbath day.
And so we don't want a man that has been blind to be able to see if it has to be done on Sabbath. We would rather have him be blind for life than to have him healed on the Sabbath.
But one of the dimensions of the gospel accounts is to give us a sense of what the Sabbath meant to the Lord and what he would have us do in imitation. And it seems to me that this is one of those moments where we see the Sabbath day raised to our view in an important way, and we can see what Jesus does, and the sense is that those who follow him will do likewise. So you're right, that he really is running against a common conception of the Sabbath and what is appropriate to do on the Sabbath, and it becomes clear that he's setting an example.
But he's not defying the law.
In their mind he is, though. Verse 16, they call him a sinner. How can a man that is a sinner who violates the Sabbath day do such miracles?
But didn't the law itself allow for
Good
what
works.
we might say good works or rescuing at certain times?
Later law allows it for someone who's in a life-threatening situation. Either an animal has fallen into a pit, or something, or a human, your child, son, daughter, has fallen, or something like that, and the law allows you to help lift that person out. But it has to be life-threatening. This is not life-threatening. This guy's been like this for a long time. What's interesting to me is that at nowhere in the account does the man complain about the years in darkness. Jesus says that he does this so the glory of God will be seen. And one could ask, well, what about this guy all these years in darkness? Doesn't he have a right to say something about that? And I'm guessing that because of what happens on this day, a day of days in this man's life, that he would say, I would go another 10 years in the darkness if it would bring me this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now look at verse 28. When we talk about this, and they said, then they reviled him and said, thou art his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spake unto Moses. As for this fellow, who are they talking about?
The Savior.
Christ. Man, we are Moses' disciples, and yet this man that is proclaiming that he's been healed, he's a disciple of a charlatan in some way.
Listen to the man born blind, his own testimony, as he begins to testify as to what's happened to him. It says in verse 31, now we know that God heareth not sinners, but if any man be a worshipper of God, and doeth his will, him he heareth. Verse 32, since the world began, was it not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind? And Joseph Smith adds, except he be of God. Mm-hmm. So in a sense now, according to their own traditions, he's healed an individual that was born blind, and only one from God can heal one born blind from birth. Mm-hmm. And so hereby in their own tradition now, he's testified as to his reality as the Messiah, and therefore his testimony has to be true.
Yeah.
It puts them in a very precarious position, not only the Jewish leadership, but all people now begin to accept and turn to him as the Messiah, and the Jewish leadership has got to deal with that.
Mm-hmm. In fact, he compels them to deal with it. In verse 39, Jesus comments, for judgment I am come into this world, that they which see not might see, and that they which see might be made blind. Mm-hmm. It's a test of their faith. It's an absolute affront to their traditions, their feelings, and again, it's another witness of how powerful he is as the Messiah.
You know, I'm always impressed when I read this story as the man that has been healed is brought before this council and eventually excommunicated.
Put out of the synagogue.
Put out of the synagogue, and really distanced from society. How Jesus hears about it, and then he goes and searches out the individual. That here's our loving Savior who does seek us out, who's willing to provide for us a way that we can see and then be brought into his fold.
I really love the healed blind man's response when the master comes to him after he's been put out, when he said, well, I don't understand all that you're accusing me of, and I don't understand all this, but I know that I didn't see before, and now I see, and I know a man of God has done this. And then Jesus says, dost thou believe on the Son of God? And I love his very simple response. Well, who is he? If I knew, I'd believe in him. And the master says, you're speaking to him. And I love that simple response. He said, Lord, I believe, and worshiped him. And then in contrast to that man who has been in darkness that is now seeing, we have those that are seeing but are in darkness. And as you see how the chapter ends, Jesus says, I am come into the world that they which see not might see, and they which see might be made blind. And then immediately that gets the hackles up of the Pharisees, and they say, well, are we blind also? And notice how Jesus responds to them. If ye were blind, ye should have no sin. But now ye say, we see therefore your sin remaineth. What's he saying by that? What is it that he's really saying to the Pharisees as the culmination of this remarkable miracle and the teaching that's really bringing it to an exclamation point? What do you think he's saying in that?
Well, in a way, he's affirming something that they tried to take away from him, according to chapter 8. That is, Jesus, you're bearing witness of yourself. And in a way, he's allowing them to condemn themselves by their own words. It's a very harsh thing, which of course will come back against them one day, those who choose to follow this kind of path. But I see him actually allowing them to weave their own rope by which they're going to hang themselves.
Interesting. That they have to deal with the very miracle that he's performed. The best evidence of what he has declared is the man that's been healed. And they can't just dismiss it and say it never really happened in that regard. Let's go to chapter 10. Chapter 10, we're probably quite familiar with the portion of it that's dealing with the sheep part. I think it's interesting that we talk a little bit about the concept of a good shepherd, because sometimes I think we read this passage in John chapter 10 and the little parable that Jesus gives about the door and the sheepfold and all of that. Maybe we ought to talk a little bit about the culture of it, but also the scriptural significance, because there have certainly been Old Testament prophecies talking about shepherds. This is not just something new that Jesus has made up as a cute little object lesson at this point. What do you see as the significance of this episode that Jesus is talking about? I am the good shepherd and the door and all of that type of stuff.